Jason Statham had been looking forward to this day for weeks. It wasn't a day for stunts, cameras, or scripts. It was just him, walking through the busy streets of the city he loved so much. Even though he was recognized by millions, he always tried to blend in, to feel normal for a little while. Today he wore a simple black jacket, a gray hoodie underneath, and dark sunglasses that mostly hid his face. He carried a small cup of coffee in his hand, the warm aroma calming him as he walked. It was early in the morning, and the streets were bustling with people heading to work, students walking to school, and street vendors setting up their carts, calling out their greetings to anyone who would listen. Jason enjoyed these quiet moments. He liked to see the world waking up, the city coming to life. It gave him a sense of peace, something he rarely found on a movie set where everything moved at lightning speed. He sipped his coffee slowly, letting the warmth spread through his hands, feeling almost invisible in the crowd. That invisibility was a gift he cherished, even if it was just for a few hours. He liked noticing little things, the way a woman's scarf caught the wind, how a man hurriedly bought a newspaper, or the way children laughed as they ran past puddles. It was ordinary life, but that was exactly what he loved. At the same time, a few blocks away, two police officers were walking down the street. They weren't bad men. They had just started their shift, and like everyone else, they were carrying the weight of their own frustrations. One had a bad morning, dealing with a complaint that had gone nowhere, and the other was tired and irritated after a long night of little sleep. They were focused on making sure the streets were safe, and today their idea of safety seemed stricter than usual. They were on edge, eyes scanning every passerby, looking for anything unusual, and then, as if by accident, their gaze landed on Jason. He was just walking, sipping his coffee, blending into the crowd, but something about his calm demeanor, the way he moved quickly but quietly, caught the attention of one of the officers. They whispered to each other, their words sharp and tense. "That guy looks suspicious," one said. "I don't know, just stay close," replied the other. Jason didn't notice them yet. He was busy observing the city, feeling relaxed for the first time in weeks. The officers, however, were now convinced that something needed to be done. Before Jason could even turn to see what was happening, one of the officers reached out suddenly and grabbed his coffee. It was an impulsive action, a mistake born from stress and misunderstanding. The cup tipped violently and the hot liquid splashed across Jason's chest and hands. He flinched instantly, a sharp burn shocking his senses. People around gasped, some stepping back, others frozen in disbelief. The street felt silent for a moment, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jason stumbled back slightly, his heart racing, more from shock than pain. His coffee was ruined, his jacket soaked, but his focus was on understanding what had just happened. For a few seconds there was chaos. Jason's eyes narrowed, not with anger at first, but with disbelief. The officer who had spilled the coffee looked equally stunned, realizing almost immediately that they had overreacted. The other officer froze, unsure what to do next. The crowd began murmuring, some shouting at the officers, telling them to back off. Others pulled out their phones, ready to record what could be a viral moment. Jason's mind raced too, but he forced himself to stay calm. He didn't want the situation to get worse. He had learned over the years that losing control only made things harder. He wiped his hand on his jacket, ignoring the sting from the hot liquid. He could feel the warmth spreading across his chest, a reminder that mistakes sometimes had real consequences. The officer stepped forward, trying to justify what they had done, but Jason held up his hand, signaling them to pause. His calmness was disarming. People in the crowd started noticing the difference in energy. While most would have shouted, cursed, or reacted angrily, Jason remained composed, making eye contact with the officers in a way that demanded attention without hostility. The tension on the street was thick. The officers' faces shifted from anger to confusion, and for a brief moment everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Jason spoke softly but clearly, asking the officer why they had acted that way. His voice wasn't accusing. It was curious, almost teaching without preaching. The officer stumbled over words, realizing how ridiculous the situation looked from the outside. I thought you were..." he started, but Jason interrupted gently. "You thought I was what? Suspicious? You didn't know me. You acted before thinking." The words were simple, yet they carried weight. People in the crowd started whispering to each other, noticing the way Jason handled the moment. He wasn't using his fame or his reputation as a strong, action-oriented person. He was using something more powerful: his presence, his calmness, his ability to make people see their actions without forcing them to feel shame. The officers' shoulders slumped, the tension in their body melting slightly. They realized their mistake not because someone yelled at them, but because Jason showed them a better way to respond. Jason took another step back, giving space to the officers and the crowd. He could feel his pulse calming down. The city noises returned slowly, the honking of cars, footsteps on the pavement, distant laughter. But the memory of the hot coffee, the sudden shock, lingered. Yet even as the pain settled, he didn't feel anger. He felt understanding. People make mistakes. People act without thinking. Today it was these officers. Tomorrow it could be anyone. The important thing was how you responded afterward. The crowd started to disperse a little, some still whispering excitedly, others just relieved that no one had gotten hurt. Jason took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air, letting the moment sink in. The officers, now more aware of their actions, stepped back as well, clearly feeling guilty and unsure how to fix the situation. Jason looked at them not with contempt but with patience, as if giving them a chance to make amends without forcing it. In that moment, Jason's presence changed everything. What could have been an angry, viral spectacle of confrontation turned into a pause, a lesson in calmness and understanding. He didn't lecture or scold. He simply existed in the moment with grace and authority. People watching learned something too. Not about him as a celebrity, but about the power of composure, empathy, and human connection. The incident became less about the coffee and more about the choices people make when they are wrong. Even as he cleaned his hands and adjusted his jacket, Jason noticed small things again: the way a child clutched their parent's hand, the way the sun reflected on a nearby window, the rhythm of life moving forward despite mistakes and misunderstandings. He smiled faintly, almost to himself, as if acknowledging that life often hits you with unexpected burns. But how you handle them defines your day, your story, even your character. The officers, watching silently, realized that they had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to correct their mistake without fear, without shame, simply by acting with decency. The street slowly returned to normal. Vendors resumed calling out, pedestrians walked by, and Jason prepared to continue his day. He took a last sip of coffee from a new cup he had grabbed after the incident, feeling the warmth not just in his hands, but in the small but meaningful moment that had just unfolded. Today he hadn't fought anyone. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't demanded respect. And yet he had commanded it in the most powerful way possible, through calmness, patience, and empathy. For those few minutes on a chilly morning in a busy city, Jason Statham had turned an accident into a lesson. A spill of hot coffee could have meant anger, conflict, and viral outrage. Instead, it became a moment of understanding, a reminder that human reactions, when guided by thoughtfulness and patience, could turn even the sharpest burn into something meaningful. And as he walked away, blending into the crowd once again, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had faced a sudden, unfair moment with dignity, and in doing so, had shown everyone around the power of choosing calm over conflict. The moment the coffee spilled, the crowd had gasped, but now the atmosphere shifted into something heavier, more charged. People stopped in their tracks, unsure whether to intervene, record, or just watch. Jason Statham, however, stood almost perfectly still, his body tense for only a second before relaxing. He realized that while the immediate shock had passed, the tension hadn't. The officers looked flustered, the kind of flustered that comes when someone realizes they've crossed a line but aren't sure how to step back. Their hands were partially raised, partially in their pockets, and the younger officer kept glancing at the older one as if silently asking, "What do we do now?" Jason wiped the hot coffee off his hands with the corner of his jacket. The burn was real, but it wasn't enough to make him angry, at least not yet. He could feel the warmth lingering on his skin, a reminder of how quickly life could change in a split second. One moment he was walking through a normal street enjoying his quiet morning. The next he was the center of a sudden confrontation. It would have been easy to lose his cool, to shout or to storm off in frustration. Most people would have. But Jason had learned over the years that reactions define outcomes far more than events themselves. He looked at the officers directly, meeting their eyes. There was no aggression in his gaze, only awareness and calm. That calmness was like a mirror. It reflected their own uncertainty back at them. The younger officer finally broke the silence. We thought you were acting suspicious," he said, his voice shaking slightly. His words came out more like a question than a statement, as if he wasn't sure he even believed them himself. The older officer nodded, muttering something under his breath about protocol and keeping the street safe. Both of them were clearly uneasy, caught between following their training and realizing they had made a mistake. Jason took a slow breath, letting the sounds of the city settle around him. He could hear the low murmur of the crowd, the distant honking of cars, the faint clatter of a bicycle on the pavement. It was as though the city itself was reminding everyone that life went on, even when mistakes were made. "Suspicious?" he repeated gently, tilting his head slightly. "Is that what you call this?" His voice was calm but firm enough to draw attention. People in the crowd leaned in slightly, sensing that something important was about to unfold. The officers fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable with the attention now on them. Jason took a small step forward, not threatening, not aggressive, just moving enough to command presence. "You made a choice in a split second," he continued. "You didn't know me. You didn't ask. You didn't even think. And now—" He paused, letting the words sink in. "We're all here in this moment because of that choice." His tone wasn't scolding. It was reflective, almost teaching, and somehow that made the officers listen. Really listen in a way they hadn't expected. One of the passers-by, a man holding a bag of groceries, muttered under his breath, "He's handling it better than I could." A woman with a stroller nodded, her eyes wide as she watched Jason's calm approach. Even the crowd's mood shifted subtly, from shock and curiosity to a quiet respect. There was something magnetic about how he carried himself. Not a celebrity aura, not arrogance or intimidation, but simple human authority. The kind that makes people think before they act, that makes them reconsider their choices, that makes them see the consequences without anyone pointing a finger. The younger officer finally spoke again, this time more clearly. I didn't mean to." His voice trailed off, the shame in his words impossible to hide. Jason didn't interrupt. Instead, he let him feel the weight of the mistake on his own. The silence stretched just long enough for the officer to internalize it. It was a moment of reflection, and Jason knew how powerful that could be. People often remembered lessons far longer when they reached the realization themselves rather than being told what was right or wrong. Jason's calmness seemed to spread like a wave. The older officer, who had been more rigid and defensive, now looked at his partner and then back at Jason, the lines of tension in his face softening slightly. He nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, signaling that he understood the gravity of the situation. Jason took a careful step back, giving both officers the space to process and decide how to respond. He wasn't leaving yet. He wanted to see this through, to ensure that the moment ended not with anger, but with understanding. A few seconds later, a small group of teenagers, who had been filming the scene on their phones, whispered to each other. "He's famous, but he's not acting like a diva," one said. He's handling it like a real person," replied the other. Their words reflected exactly what was happening. Jason's reaction wasn't about fame or ego. It was about human decency. It reminded everyone watching that how we respond to sudden challenges reveals the best parts of ourselves. The younger officer, now visibly shaken, spoke again. We acted too quickly. I'm sorry." The apology was quiet, genuine, and it made the crowd murmur approval. Jason nodded, accepting it without any display of superiority. "Thank you," he said simply. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. That's the first step in fixing a mistake." His words were simple, but they carried depth. The crowd seemed to lean closer, hanging on every word, captivated by the rare scene of calm accountability unfolding in a place usually dominated by rush and chaos. The older officer took a deep breath, the kind that comes when you realize you've been given a second chance. We can help clean this up," he said, gesturing awkwardly toward Jason's ruined jacket. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Jason smiled faintly, appreciating the gesture. He knew that sometimes the smallest actions, helping wipe off a spill, offering a new coffee, meant far more than long-winded apologies. They were real, tangible signs that someone wanted to make things right. As the officers bent slightly to help with napkins and tissues, the crowd relaxed even more. People who had been tense and ready to judge were now witnessing something entirely different, a transformation of conflict into cooperation. Jason continued to speak softly, explaining in short, relatable sentences how life sometimes threw unexpected moments at us, and how our response mattered far more than the event itself. Everyone has bad mornings, he said. Everyone makes mistakes. But the choice to fix it, to act with kindness instead of anger, that's what changes the story. The officers nodded as they worked, clearly absorbing the lesson in a way that went beyond a simple reprimand. The young officer handed Jason a fresh napkin and muttered, "We'll be more careful next time." Jason accepted the words with a calm nod, letting the sincerity land. He didn't need them to promise anything grandiose. He just needed them to see the mistake, to feel its weight, and to choose better next time. That alone was enough. The crowd began to murmur among themselves again, this time not in shock or gossip, but in admiration. They had just witnessed something rare, a human moment where confrontation didn't escalate, where anger didn't dominate, where fame didn't overshadow simple decency. Jason had become a bridge, turning a potentially volatile scene into a lesson in empathy and accountability. Children who had stopped to watch tugged at their parents' hands, pointing out how the man hadn't yelled, hadn't pushed back, hadn't made threats. Adults nodded, some smiling, realizing they had learned something without even expecting it. Jason straightened his jacket, still warm from the spilled coffee, and took another careful sip from the replacement cup. The taste was good, comforting, grounding him as the moment continued to unfold. The officers stood a little straighter too, their posture reflecting a mix of relief and humility. No one had yelled, no one had fought, and yet everyone in the street felt the weight of what had happened and the lesson it carried. As Jason prepared to continue his walk, he looked back one last time at the officers. "Remember," he said, "it's not the mistake that defines us. It's how we respond. That's what people remember." His words lingered in the air, a quiet reminder to everyone nearby that the power to change a situation often rested not in anger or authority, but in patience, presence, and understanding. The officers nodded, their expressions softening even more. They seemed to understand that today, they had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to learn in public without humiliation, to see the impact of their actions, and to be reminded that humanity mattered more than ego or protocol. Jason turned, adjusted his sunglasses, and continued down the street, blending once again into the rhythm of the city. People in the crowd watched him go, still whispering, still amazed at the calmness and strength he had shown. Even as he walked away, the warmth of the coffee and the warmth of the lesson he had imparted mingled in his mind. Today, a simple act, a mistaken spill of coffee, had become a moment of reflection for strangers, a public lesson in humility and patience. Jason Statham, without raising his voice or using his fame, had reminded everyone around him that human reactions, when handled with care, could turn any mistake into a meaningful moment. After the spilled coffee incident, the street seemed quieter, but the tension was still there, only now it was softer, more reflective. Jason Statham had taken a few steps back to give the officers some space, but he didn't walk away. He knew that moments like this didn't end when people stop shouting or when the crowd disperses. They ended when understanding happens, when lessons are felt and absorbed. And that's exactly what Jason wanted. Not anger, not spectacle, but understanding. The officers stood awkwardly, shifting from one foot to another. The younger one kept glancing down at the sidewalk as if hoping the ground might swallow him up, while the older one folded his arms trying to look in control, but failing. Jason noticed it all, the nervous energy, the tiny signs of guilt, and he realized that this moment wasn't just about the spilled coffee. It was about the choices people make when faced with confrontation and how they respond when someone doesn't react with aggression. "Look," Jason said, his voice calm but firm. "I know you were just doing your job. I get it, you have rules, protocols, things you need to follow. But that doesn't give anyone the right to act without thinking. It doesn't give anyone the right to hurt someone, even if it's by accident." He paused, letting the words sink in. The officers looked at him now, really looking. Their eyes weren't defensive anymore. They were listening. They could feel the weight of what he was saying. Jason continued, "We all have moments when we're rushed, when we're stressed, when we think we're right. And sometimes those moments make us do things we regret. But the important part is what happens next. How you handle the mistake, that's what matters. He looked around at the small crowd that had formed, noticing their expressions of curiosity and admiration. This wasn't about him being famous. It was about what anyone could do in a tense situation. His calmness, his patience, it was contagious. The younger officer swallowed hard, finally finding the courage to speak. I guess I acted too fast. I didn't mean to. His voice trailed off. Jason didn't interrupt. He let the officer stumble through the words, letting him feel the discomfort of admitting he was wrong. The older officer exhaled slowly, clearly processing everything. He looked at his partner, then back at Jason, realizing that the young officer's words were sincere but incomplete. There was still a lesson to be absorbed, a deeper understanding to be gained. Jason's eyes softened. It's okay to admit mistakes, he said gently. It's more than okay. It's the only way to move forward. But an apology isn't enough if it's just words. You need to act. You need to show in what you do next that you understand the impact of your actions. The officers nodded slowly. The words weren't harsh, but they carried a weight that made the air feel heavier in a thoughtful way. People in the crowd leaned in slightly, sensing that this was no longer about coffee. It was about responsibility, accountability, and human decency. One of the passers-by, an older woman with a small dog on a leash, whispered to her companion. He's teaching them, but gently, not like a lecture, more like a mirror. That was exactly what Jason was doing. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't making threats. He was holding up a mirror, showing the officers what their actions looked like from the outside, showing them the consequences of impulsive decisions. It was subtle but powerful. The younger officer finally raised his eyes. I think I understand, he said. I should have asked before acting. I shouldn't have assumed. Jason nodded approvingly. Exactly, he replied. Assumptions can hurt people. Acting without thinking can hurt even more. You have to remember that every person you encounter has a life, a story, and a world you don't know. That's what makes it important to pause even for a second and think before you act. The older officer, who had been quiet for most of the moment, finally spoke. We didn't see it that way before. We just reacted. Jason gave a small, understanding smile. And that's human. But it doesn't have to end there. You can choose to do better next time. That's the point. Learning, growing, understanding, those are the things that matter. Not being right, not showing authority, but being human. His words were simple, but they hit deeper than anyone in the crowd expected. As Jason spoke, the atmosphere changed further. People in the crowd started nodding subtly, some murmuring among themselves, amazed at the scene unfolding. It wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was a quiet teaching moment. Children tugged at their parents, pointing out how the man hadn't yelled, hadn't pushed back. Adults looked on, reflecting on their own lives and mistakes. Everyone, in a small way, was learning something. Jason had turned a simple accident into a lesson that reached beyond just the people involved. The officers began to act differently, too. The younger one picked up some napkins from a nearby stand, offering them to Jason with a nervous but sincere gesture. The older officer nodded, showing small, almost imperceptible signs of humility. Jason accepted the gesture with a calm nod, making the act of making amends feel natural, not forced. It was a quiet, human moment, a small repair of a larger mistake. Jason's eyes softened further as he looked at them. It's never too late to change your approach, he said. Even in a single moment, even after a mistake, you can choose to do the right thing. You can choose patience over anger, understanding over pride. That's what people remember. He paused, letting the words settle. The officers were quiet now, absorbing each syllable. They could feel the weight of what he was saying, and they could feel themselves wanting to live up to it. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but many stayed a few steps back, watching quietly. No one wanted to interrupt the moment. The lesson wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simple, human, real. Jason had managed to turn what could have been a viral confrontation into a story about empathy, accountability, and patience. People were learning silently without being forced to. The younger officer finally spoke again, a little stronger this time. We'll be more careful. We'll think first, act later. I promise. Jason nodded once more, his expression calm and approving. That's all anyone can ask for, he said. Actions matter more than words. Live by that, and you'll see the difference in every encounter. The older officer, still holding a small stack of napkins, exhaled deeply. We understand, he said simply. We understand now. Jason smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't need applause or attention. It was a quiet acknowledgement that a lesson had been learned, that human understanding had replaced impulsive action. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his hoodie, and prepared to continue walking down the street. But before he did, he looked back one last time at the officers. Remember, he said softly, almost to himself, it's not the mistake that defines us. It's how we respond. That's what people notice. That's what matters. The officers nodded once more, visibly changed. They had been given a chance to see themselves from the outside, to witness the impact of their actions, and to make amends in a way that felt real, human, and grounded. It wasn't about punishment or fame or authority. It was about understanding, reflection, and choice. The crowd, now thinning, whispered to each other about what they had just witnessed. Some said quietly, "I've never seen anyone handle a mistake like that," while others simply nodded, taking in the lesson for themselves. Jason took a final sip from his new coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him, grounding him as he walked away. The street returned to its usual rhythm, the distant honks, the chatter of people, the shuffle of feet. But the moment left an imprint. It was a reminder that even small acts, even seemingly insignificant mistakes, could turn into profound lessons if handled with patience and understanding. And as he disappeared into the crowd, blending once again with the city life, the officers stayed behind, reflecting quietly. They would remember this day, not as a day they made a mistake, but as a day they learned something far more important. Jason Statham hadn't yelled, hadn't fought, hadn't demanded respect. Yet in his calm, composed, human approach, he had commanded something far stronger: reflection, accountability, and the desire to be better. For everyone watching, it was a lesson they would carry silently as they returned to their lives. Jason's presence had transformed what could have been a moment of anger into a moment of growth, a moment of reflection, a moment of human connection. And as the city moved forward, life continued. But the memory of that morning, the spilled coffee, the calm man, and the officers learning quietly, lingered, quietly teaching everyone who had seen it what it meant to act with understanding, patience, and humanity. The street had slowly returned to its usual rhythm, with people walking past, talking quietly, and going about their mornings. But in the middle of it all, a small group lingered, still focused on the scene that had just unfolded. Jason Statham stood there, coffee cup in hand, calm and composed. The two officers who had caused the initial chaos were now quieter, their faces showing a mixture of embarrassment and reflection. They had been taught a lesson, but now it was time to act, to show that they understood it not just in words, but in deeds. Jason wiped a small splash of coffee from his jacket and noticed that the younger officer had bent down slightly, picking up a few napkins from a nearby stand. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. The officer handed them over to Jason with a nervous smile. "Here," he said quietly, I hope this helps a little." Jason took the napkins and nodded. "Thank you," he said. "It's a start. That's all any of us can do. Start." The simple exchange drew the attention of some of the bystanders, who began whispering among themselves. People were starting to realize that this wasn't just a minor street incident. It was a moment of genuine human connection. The older officer stepped forward, holding out a small paper cup he had bought from a nearby vendor. "I thought maybe this one's better," he said. "A fresh coffee on me." Jason smiled faintly and accepted it. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, no superiority. He simply acknowledged the effort and took the cup, appreciating the thought behind it. The small gestures mattered far more than words could convey. The act of trying to make things right had turned the entire situation around, transforming tension and conflict into a quiet display of humanity. Jason spoke softly, addressing the officers and the crowd at the same time. "It's not about being perfect," he said. "It's about recognizing when you're wrong and doing what you can to make it better. That's what matters. That's what people remember." He sipped his new coffee slowly, enjoying the warmth and letting the words settle in the air. The crowd, though smaller now, hung on. Every word. Even those who had initially been critical of the officers were now watching with interest, realizing that the incident had become more than a simple mistake. It had become a lesson in accountability and empathy. The younger officer nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. We see that now, he said quietly. We acted too fast. We didn't consider what it might feel like from your side. I want to fix it, Jason smiled gently. And you can, he said. Actions speak louder than words. Help when you can. Be patient. Think before you act. That's all it takes. The officers seemed to take a deep breath together, the tension leaving their bodies slowly. They had learned that humility wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. And today, they had experienced it firsthand. Jason glanced around at the crowd, noticing the expressions of people who had been watching quietly. Some were nodding subtly, others whispering to one another. He realized that this moment had reached far beyond himself and the officers. People were learning, reflecting, and reconsidering how they reacted to their own mistakes in daily life. A young woman with a backpack whispered to a friend, I've never seen someone handle a mistake like that. Calm, patient. He's teaching without even trying. Her friend nodded in agreement, both of them inspired by what had happened. The officers began to act more attentively now. The younger one, still looking a bit nervous, bent down to help Jason wipe the remaining coffee stains from his jacket. The older officer stepped closer, offering a few extra napkins and helping with the small task. It was a humble scene, but powerful. They weren't doing it because they had to. They were doing it because they wanted to make amends. And that subtle difference made all the difference in the world. Jason spoke again, keeping his tone calm and gentle. It's amazing how small actions can change everything, he said. A moment of patience, a gesture of understanding, even a simple apology. These things matter. They matter far more than anger or blame. They remind us that we're all human and that we can choose better every single day. The crowd leaned in slightly, listening and absorbing every word. Children watched quietly, parents smiled, and even some people who had initially been skeptical now seemed to understand the lesson being shared. The younger officer finally said something that made Jason pause and nod. I didn't realize how much my actions could affect someone, he admitted. It was just coffee, but I see now it was more than that. It could have been a bigger mistake if I hadn't acted differently. Jason smiled faintly. Exactly. Even small mistakes can become big lessons if we respond with care. You can turn them around, and that's what counts. His words carried no judgment, only understanding and encouragement. The older officer added quietly, We'll be more careful in the future. We'll think before acting, not just because of what happened, but because it's the right thing to do. Jason nodded. That's all anyone can ask for. Doing the right thing, even when no one is watching, that's what matters most. Today you've had a chance to practice that. And you did well, the crowd murmured softly, appreciating the sincerity of the exchange. Jason took another sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through him as he watched the officers adjust their posture, visibly more relaxed yet reflective. He realized that the real change wasn't just in the words spoken. It was in the small gestures, the acknowledgement of mistakes and the willingness to make amends. This was what human connection looked like, simple, tangible, and genuine. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but many stayed a few steps back, observing quietly. The incident had become something more than just a spilled coffee. It was a moment of real-life teaching, showing that patience, calmness, and empathy could transform even the tensest situations. People were learning without being forced, reflecting without being told what to think, and that made the moment all the more powerful. Jason straightened his jacket and took a final sip from the cup. Remember, he said softly, addressing both the officers and anyone still listening. It's never about the mistake itself. It's about what you do afterward. That's what defines you. That's what people notice. That's what makes a difference. The officers nodded, their expressions softened by understanding and humility. They had seen firsthand how a calm, patient approach could change everything. The younger officer finally smiled faintly, a small sign of relief and acceptance. Thank you for showing us this, he said. Jason nodded, giving a reassuring smile. No need to thank me. Just take what you've learned and use it. That's enough. The older officer exhaled slowly, clearly feeling lighter. He nodded too, silently acknowledging the lesson. Jason looked around at the remaining onlookers, many of whom were still watching quietly. Some whispered to one another, inspired by the scene. Children pointed excitedly at the man who had remained calm and kind, while parents nodded in agreement. Even strangers passing by seemed to notice the subtle shift in energy. A moment of tension had turned into a moment of reflection, teaching, and understanding, a rare and powerful transformation that few would forget. Jason took one last sip of coffee and adjusted his hoodie, preparing to continue his walk. But before he did, he looked back at the officers once more. "Remember," he said quietly, almost to himself, "small actions, patience, understanding, they matter more than anger. They matter more than authority. They matter more than being right. People remember how you make them feel, not what you think you're enforcing." The officers nodded once again, clearly absorbing the message. As Jason walked away, blending into the city crowd once more, the two officers remained behind, reflecting on everything that had just happened. They had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to learn without being humiliated, a chance to see the impact of their actions, and a chance to make amends in a meaningful way. They understood now that human reactions, when handled with thoughtfulness and care, could turn mistakes into lessons, conflict into connection, and tension into respect. The crowd, now dispersing completely, carried the memory of the moment with them. It was a quiet, subtle lesson, but powerful nonetheless. People had seen how a calm, patient approach could change the outcome of a potentially volatile situation. They had witnessed humility, understanding, and empathy in action. And for a few minutes on that busy city street, the world felt just a little better because of it. Jason disappeared into the rhythm of the city, coffee in hand, but the impact of the moment lingered. The officers, the crowd, and even those passing by had been reminded that mistakes happen, but how we respond is what truly matters. And that, more than anything, was the real lesson of the morning: the power of patience, the importance of empathy, and the strength in human connection. The city street slowly returned to its usual rhythm after the coffee incident. But for those who had witnessed it, the moment left a lasting impression. Jason Statham walked calmly down the pavement, coffee in hand, blending into the crowd as if nothing had happened. Yet inside he felt a quiet satisfaction. He knew that what had started as a sudden, painful moment had turned into something much bigger. It had become a real-life lesson about patience, empathy, and human connection. The officers had been given a chance to reflect and act differently, and the crowd had seen a rare example of calm authority in action. As Jason walked, he noticed people turning to watch him, whispering among themselves. Some recognized him. Others just felt something familiar in his presence, something that didn't come from fame or reputation, but from the way he carried himself. There was no arrogance, no desire for attention. He wasn't walking to be noticed. He was walking because the city was alive and he wanted to be part of it. Every step reminded him that ordinary life, even in a busy city, could be extraordinary when people acted with understanding and patience. The two officers, still on the scene, watched him leave. Their expressions had changed from embarrassment to reflection, and finally to something lighter, a sense of relief and understanding. They realized that this morning could have ended with anger, conflict, and embarrassment, but instead it had ended with a lesson that they would carry with them for the rest of their careers. One officer finally spoke, almost to himself. "I've never seen someone handle a situation like that, with calm and patience." His partner nodded quietly. The realization settling in that true authority didn't always come from power or enforcement, but from how you treat people even when mistakes happen. Jason continued walking, his coffee warming his hands as the city moved around him. Vendors called out. Cars honked in the distance and pedestrians went about their day, but the earlier tension seemed to linger in a softer, reflective way. People who had witnessed the scene were now smiling quietly, whispering stories to friends and family about what they had seen. He didn't yell. He didn't fight. And yet he commanded respect, one woman said, shaking her head in admiration. Her companion nodded, realizing that true strength could be quiet, subtle and human. For Jason, the lesson of the morning was simple but powerful. Human reactions define moments, not the events themselves. The spilled coffee could have become a viral scandal, an angry confrontation, or even a legal incident. But instead it became a story of empathy, patience, and accountability. He had seen the officers reflect on their actions, make amends, and learn in real time. And he had seen the crowd absorb the lesson silently, without being forced, simply by observing human behavior at its best. As he walked past a small park, Jason noticed a group of children playing nearby. He paused for a moment, watching them run, laugh, and tumble over the grass. There was something grounding about their innocence, their ability to move forward without holding on to mistakes. It reminded him that life often gave people second chances, and it was up to each individual to decide how to use them. The spilled coffee, the moment of tension, the reflection, and the small acts of kindness. Everything had become part of a larger lesson about choice, reaction, and humanity. Meanwhile, back on the street, the officers continued their day, but they were visibly changed. The younger officer walked a little taller, the older one more thoughtful. They had experienced firsthand the power of calm and patient action, and they would carry it with them in every encounter going forward. Every citizen they met, every situation they faced would now be colored by the memory of this morning. They had learned that authority didn't mean acting first or assuming the worst. It meant understanding, reflecting, and acting with integrity. Jason made his way to a quiet cafe a few blocks away, taking a seat by the window. He ordered another cup of coffee, not for himself alone, but as a small pause to reflect. The morning had been unusual, intense, and meaningful. He thought about how quickly a small mistake could turn into a moment of learning. He considered the officers, the crowd, and the people walking past, and he smiled faintly, realizing that his role had been simple, yet impactful. He hadn't forced anyone to change. He had simply demonstrated the power of calm, human behavior, and the lesson had taken root naturally. Outside the window, life continued as usual. Street vendors sold their goods, children ran after each other, and commuters hurried to work. Yet for those who had seen the incident unfold, something had shifted. They had witnessed a man, faced with an unfair action, respond with patience and understanding rather than anger. They had seen the officers reflect, apologize, and act to make things right. And they had seen that small gestures, the offering of napkins, a replacement coffee, a kind word, could carry far more meaning than harsh words or anger. Jason sipped his coffee slowly, thinking about the way small actions could ripple outwards. A moment of patience here, a gesture of understanding there, and the entire energy of a situation could change. The spilled coffee had been accidental, but the way it had been handled turned it into a story of human connection, reflection, and accountability. It reminded him that life often threw unexpected challenges at people, and the response to those challenges defined who they were. The officers, meanwhile, wrapped up their own reflections. They talked quietly among themselves, considering how the morning could shape their approach to work and to life. They had learned that even in stressful situations, taking a moment to pause, reflect, and act with kindness could prevent conflict, build trust, and create respect. They understood that the small choices they made every day, the way they interacted with others, mattered far more than strict enforcement or immediate reactions. Back in the cafe, Jason noticed people walking past the window, some glancing in as if sensing the calm energy inside. He thought about the crowd on the street, the way people had absorbed the lesson without being told to. He realized that human behavior, when modeled with patience, empathy, and integrity, could teach far more than words alone ever could. Today, a small incident had become a lesson in humanity, and the impact would continue quietly, subtly, in the minds and hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. Jason finished his coffee and left the cafe, walking through the city streets once more. The morning light cast long shadows across the pavement, and the hum of the city felt alive and connected. People continued their routines, but some carried the memory of what they had seen, the calmness, the understanding, the patience, and the quiet teaching. They would remember how one man, faced with an unexpected challenge, had responded not with anger, but with empathy and reflection. As he disappeared into the crowd, Jason felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The spilled coffee, the confrontation, the lessons, it had all become part of something bigger. A story about how human behavior could transform moments of tension into moments of learning, reflection, and connection. The officers had learned, the crowd had learned, and even Jason himself had felt the power of small actions, patience, and understanding in creating real change. The day continued, but the memory of the morning lingered. People would recount it quietly to friends, to family, to strangers, and the story would carry a lesson far beyond its original setting. Mistakes happen, accidents occur, and tension arises, but the way people respond to themselves, to others, and to the world defines the true outcome. Jason Statham had demonstrated that lesson with calm, patience, and humanity, leaving a quiet but lasting impression on everyone involved. In the end, the morning was no longer about spilled coffee or a brief confrontation. It was about human connection, the power of calm action, and the importance of empathy. It was about learning, reflecting, and choosing to act better in the future. And for those who had witnessed it, the lesson would remain long after the city returned to its usual rhythm. A simple, human reminder that understanding, patience, and integrity could turn even the smallest incident into a meaningful moment. Jason walked on, blending into the flow of the city, carrying the warmth of his coffee and the satisfaction of a lesson well taught. The officers returned to their duties with a newfound perspective, and the crowd dispersed with a quiet sense of reflection. The city moved forward as it always did, but the morning had changed something quietly, subtly, in the hearts of everyone who had been there. And that was the true impact of the day. Not the coffee, not the confrontation, but the lesson of humanity, patience, and connection that would ripple outward, far beyond a single moment on a busy city street.